Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology, Chennai.
When you change to an electric car, you reduce pollution, both outside and inside. Change what you can with the MG ZS EV.
डिशवॉशर है ना?
जितनी स्क्रबिंग उतनी सफाई।
इसमें आपके बेटे ने दाल मखनी जलाई थी, फिर भी चकाचक।
Bosch, Indian kitchen का डिशवॉशर।
Hello and a very warm welcome to day 2 of the Business Today Most Powerful Women Awards. Of course, this is the first time we are doing this virtually. I'm Shweta Punj, Deputy Editor with India Today magazine, and absolutely delighted to be here, to be presenting these awards. At the outset, I'd like to thank our sponsors, presenting sponsor Sathyabama University, MG Motors, Bosch Home Appliances, and of course our holistic beauty partner, Oriflame. Well, we are conducting these awards virtually, and this has been a tough year for everyone. So this was a tough, challenging task for us also to put this list together, because only the best rise to the very top. Well, this year, we have keynote addresses on the 4 areas dominating our lives today: economy, health, communications, and entertainment. And of course, we have leaders in each of these spaces to talk about this. Let's begin with our first keynote. As always, no conversation can begin without talking about the economy. Everyone wants to know what's happening with the economy, if things are going to get better, when things are going to get better. We have with us Ms. Prachi Mishra of the International Monetary Fund, who's speaking on limping economies and the recovery task. Ms. Mishra has just moved to the IMF from Goldman Sachs, where she was Managing Director of Global Macro Research.
It's indeed my pleasure and privilege to speak at this event. Let me start my talk by paying my heartfelt tribute to Dr. Ishar Judge Ahluwalia, a renowned Indian woman economist who passed away on Saturday. Ishar, you will be fondly remembered, especially by Indian women economists whom you deeply inspired and will continue to do so in the future. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 perhaps somewhat related topics. First is the current COVID-19 situation and its implications for the global economy. The second is the global rise in populist vote, what explains it, and try to link it to some gender issues as well, as that's the topic of the conclave. And third, the role of women in credit, finance, and in the labor force in India. So the global economy is facing the most unparalleled shock in the post-war history. Some people actually compare it with the global financial crisis. But actually, in my view, the comparison is quite misplaced. The shock is truly different this time around. And one key difference vis-a-vis earlier episodes is that the fear and scare factor among citizens was actually not prevalent during any of the previous recessions. The COVID-19 shock also has the unique characteristic that the response to the shock itself, that is, the virus control and the social distancing measures, have a damaging effect on the economy. The International Monetary Fund projects global GDP to contract by 4.9% in 2020. And this is certainly the deepest recession since at least the Second World War. As the size of the pie shrinks, it is important to remember that there will be redistribution as well in terms of who gets what slice of the shrunk pie. Let me say that the good news is that the global recovery has already begun. And on the flip side, though, the recovery is spread quite unevenly. And the policy support globally has indeed been massive and has generally led to stabilization in disposable incomes. The key risk to global recovery, however, is the continued rise in disease caseload. And more important, what I would like to call the phoenix-like rise of the virus. So just when one thinks that it has subsided, it actually rises from the ashes, euphemistically called as a second wave. So sustained virus control and economic recovery, in my view, will remain at the minimum, a daunting task until a vaccine is approved. And not only that, it is economically available on a mass scale, another hugely daunting task. Usually, in normal times, vaccine development takes years and years. In these unusual times, it has all been fast forwarded. Unusual times and unusual measures indeed. While uncertainties are high, it is likely that a large number of vaccines hopefully and eventually would gain approval. With this, let me come to India. Let me say that we stand apart purely from orders of magnitude due to the vast population. And so it is in COVID. There are probably few countries in the world which have population larger than one state in India, that is Uttar Pradesh. While the virus was ravaging in Italy, a mass equal to Italy's population was just reverse migrating to the villages in India. So unlike several other countries, the virus situation is indeed still escalating in India. We are adding like 90,000 to 100,000 cases per day. And of course, India took very strong measures to combat the spread of the virus very swiftly and imposed among the most stringent lockdowns across the world. And nowhere a lockdown anywhere near to the extent of covering 1.3 billion people has been implemented. So the puzzle remains that, notwithstanding the mother of all lockdowns, why is the virus situation still escalating in India? And there are two explanations in my view. First is the enforcement. While we did a good job in densely populated localized areas like Dharavi in Mumbai, by and large, effective enforcement for a diverse and large population in India has indeed been a challenge. And second, social discipline, particularly the differencing between individual and civic space, is in fact a pipe dream in India. So bottom line, where do we go from here? My overall sense is that clearly economic activity is recovering. But if you look at a host of economic indicators, on average, we are 75% back to normal compared to pre-COVID. Still far behind compared to several other countries in the region or globally in the recovery path. So by March 2022, GDP would most likely be still marginally below pre-COVID levels. And if we compare with the pre-crisis trend, say we assume a 5 to 6% trend growth for India, we would still be roughly 10% below the trend by 2022. Of course, none of this is sacrosanct. If we see further macroeconomic policy support going forward, the recovery could be faster.
Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology, Chennai.
What are you looking at, Dad?
4WD.
Four weird doodles?
No! Four-wheel
drive.
MG Gloucester. Bookings now open.
डिशवॉशर है ना?
जितनी स्क्रबिंग उतनी सफाई।
इसमें आपके बेटे ने दाल मखनी जलाई थी, फिर भी चकाचक।
Bosch, Indian kitchen का dishwasher.
Let me switch gears a bit and move to the second part of my intervention and talk a little bit about populism and why globally we have seen a rise in populist vote. And is it really related to economic shocks? In particular, the recent shock, will it further lead to a rise in populist vote globally? And let me point to a recent strand of research on which I've been working with co-authors at the International Monetary Fund and also at Bocconi University in Italy, where we try and understand why populist vote has been on a rise globally. So if you ask a populist voter, she's going to say, I'm very happy because the populist vote is on the rise everywhere. Finally, we are winning. Unfortunately, you economists have not understood us. Recently, you started writing a lot of papers, but you're not really getting to the core of the issues. You're focusing exclusively on economics. The economist is going to say, wait a moment, the economy can actually explain a lot. We have revised our understanding of political economy. A few years ago, we just focused on the aggregate economy. Parties in power won elections if the economy was doing well. Therefore, politicians had the incentive to have expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. And short-sighted or misinformed voters voted for parties promising easy policies. And the simple idea was called the political economy cycle and explained well what was happening. The populace is then going to come back and say, fine, but now this is not true for the current situation. Look at the map of Europe. Poland was the country that suffered less economic crisis in the last 10 years in Europe, and populists are in power. On the contrary, if you look at Ireland and Portugal, they suffered a deep crisis and they have no populist party. Switzerland, with an enviable economic situation and very low unemployment, has one of the strongest populist parties in Europe. How do you explain this? And The Economist is going to tell you, simple, in a nutshell, the old Heckscholine framework established to explain trade patterns based on comparative advantage related to factor endowments tells us that factor prices change after liberalization, creating some losers, such as owners of factors whose price goes down, and some winners. And the losers of liberalization are typically the low-skilled workers exposed to foreign competition or workers who lose the job because of technological progress. They tend to vote for populists. And it's not only about trade and globalization, technological progress is important too. By displacing disproportionately unskilled labor works in the same way as trade does. Displaced workers because of technological progress or trade are considered the losers of modern times. The populists would then ask, interesting, but your theory does not explain why the so-called losers vote for me and do not vote for other parties as they did in the past. So basically what we show through rigorous empirical economic research that uses European social survey data to measure vote for populist parties is that economic shocks are important only when the initial level of trust is low. So if voters simply lose trust in the current establishment, including all pre-existing parties, they realize that the people, quote unquote, the people are separated from this perceived, quote unquote, the corrupt elite. So political scientists often use a nice definition of populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, quote unquote, the pure people and quote unquote, the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale of the people. This definition puts the emphasis on mistrust of the people towards the elite, and populist leaders basically give a voice to the losers. Of course, it's an open question where India lies on this populist politics scale. India is probably far too diverse to put into such well-defined compartments. Let me highlight, two other interesting findings from this strand of research. We actually find that, members of civil society or associations are less likely to vote populist. And civil society could provide an ideological anchor or a protective shield against populism, or alternatively as a vehicle or means to foster populist ideology. The second interesting finding related to the topic of the conclave today is that we find that women are less likely to vote for populist parties. So the negative relationship between women and far-right populist parties in Europe has long been noted. So in the past, authors have argued that women may be discouraged by the fact that far-right parties have conservative values on civil rights, which may not be that appealing to many women. And more recently, an alternative explanation has been proposed, which is that women tend to vote conservative parties, but dislike extremist parties that are stigmatized as outsiders. With this, let me move on to the last part of my intervention today, the role of women in India. And let me start with credit and finance and point to some ongoing research I've been doing with Raghu Rajan and N.R. Prabhala, where we look at data from a very large credit bureau in India and explore the determinants of credit culture. And an interesting finding related to gender issues is that women are less likely to be inquired by the credit bureau compared to men, and they also tend to default less. A truly distressing fact from the labor literature and the data in India is that the rates at which women participate in India's labor force has declined dramatically and consistently over the last few decades. Some estimates, in fact, suggest that it fell to below 20% over the last couple of years. So research from the IMF, in fact, suggests that India stands out as having the lowest female labor force participation when compared to peers in Asia. It is clear that, for any country to progress, women have to be engaged very actively in its labor force. And this is perhaps one of the major current challenges facing India. With this, let me conclude with a personal anecdote relating to my own journey. I was born in Patna, went to Delhi for undergraduate and master's at the Delhi School of Economics, and moved on for a PhD to the United States at Columbia University. And then I came back to serve the government and the central bank in several roles. I remember while I was working in one of my previous jobs, a former finance minister actually asked me, from the streets of Patna, how did you manage all this? And my answer was, actually, my mother did not even come from the streets of Patna. She came from the streets of a small town called Madhubani and did not even have formal education till high school. And still she rose to be one of the well-known doctors in the state of Bihar. While I give my mother's anecdote, I would conclude by saying that, more broadly, my achievements are far less than the last generation of Indian women. Let me stop here and thank you very much to Business Today for giving me this opportunity.
Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology, Chennai.